Hi friends, I'm Grayson coming to you once again from the office of the CEO. This is my show where I can help you be more successful in your current career, and I can also help you successfully transition to a new career. So today's episode, I'm breaking it up into several parts. This is part one, and I'm going to help define for you certain corporate jargon, certain terms of art or lingo that you're going to hear if you're in any job in corporate America, in meetings, on conference calls. You'll see these phrases used in email, and nobody's necessarily going to define them for you, and you might be too embarrassed to ask what they mean. But they're going to be used, and they're going to be used when people are giving directions to you in terms of certain projects they want you to handle, and they're certainly going to expect you to use these phrases back to them. So in order to be prepared for those situations, I thought I would spend a few episodes sort of defining these for you. So let's just get started. So the first one is one that you guys have heard me use in previous episodes, so you probably have a pretty firm understanding of what it means, but just in case, I'm going to define for you the concept of the C-suite. So the C-suite is otherwise known as the SLT, the senior leadership team, or upper management or executive management. And so these are the folks who directly report to the CEO, and it's also the CEO who, as you hopefully know already, directly reports to the board. So this is called the C-suite because mostly all the people in this group have the word chief in their title. So the CEO is the chief executive officer, the CFO is the chief financial officer, the COO is the chief operating officer, the CMO is the chief marketing officer, the CHRO is the chief human resources officer, so on and so forth. And every company is going to have a slightly different group of titles in the C-suite, depending on the business needs, what industry they're in, what sectors they hit, what sorts of jobs they need to be at the very upper levels of management. These folks are very important for you to understand who they are, because they directly or indirectly impact and affect your career at the company. And you should also, of course, be extremely aware to the extent that your boss or your direct manager is one of the members of the C-suite or the SLT, because that person has a lot more power than other folks in the company. And so that's something where you should accord more deference to that if that person is your boss, but also you can use it to your advantage, to the extent that you become close with your boss and you can ultimately have authentic, in-depth conversations with them about issues that you're seeing or things they might want to know about company-wide or things that you think they ought to take and discuss with the rest of the C-suite. You might be able to impact some really good positive change at your company and ultimately have that issue heard by the board, because every member of the C-suite has to regularly report to the board. So that's the C-suite, otherwise known as the SLT or senior leadership team. So the second phrase that I want to talk to you guys about today is this phrase called green shoots. So you've probably heard this phrase if you're at a company that hasn't been doing too well recently, or they've run into a dry patch, sales are down, they're losing some customers, what have you, right? So green shoot just refers to a sign of economic or financial recovery. It's not hard to understand the origins of this phrase, right? So let's say you've got a garden and it's gone brown for some reason, everything has died and it's really just more barren earth than anything else. And you'll be so happy that after you've tended to it and you've tried to fix whatever the issues are, you'll see little green shoots popping up out of the brown earth. And of course, you're going to want to nurture those green shoots. You're going to want to understand what you did to make those green shoots start to pop up out of the earth. You're going to also want to look at them and say, is that a green shoot that I necessarily want? Or is that something that doesn't necessarily belong in this garden, although we can transplant it to another garden? So a green shoot is just sort of any sign of recovery, any sign that you're doing something right to fix whatever failings the company has been experiencing recently. And then you figure out how to further nurture it to make it grow, or you figure out whether maybe it's not an appropriate thing in this company, but you can maybe sell it to another company and make some additional money that way. So if you see a green shoot, that's generally a good thing, one way or the other. So next concept is scalability. So scalability is just the capacity of something to change in size, generally to get bigger and still remain profitable. So people will ask you all the time if you've come up with an idea for a new product, or if you're running a particular business line at a company, or if you've initiated some sort of initiative and it's doing very well, at some point, eventually, somebody's going to come and say, what's the scalability of this product or this business line? Can it get bigger? So in other words, can you maintain or hopefully improve your profit margin while still increasing your sales volume? Can you meet market demand but remain profitable? Now, not everything is scalable, and that can be okay, but generally speaking, in corporate America, we want things to grow and get bigger, but of course remain profitable and become even more profitable. So that's what it means to be scalable. Can you make it bigger and still make money off of it? You need to have that answer at the ready all the time, because they will ask you that question. Next concept is churn. So churn just refers to the turnover of customers of a business or the users of a service of that particular company. So that just means attrition, i.e. customers that you're losing or users of your service that you're losing during that particular month. And they will always compare churn with growth. So what new customers and how many new customers did you gain during that same month? Or how many new users of your service did you gain during that same month? And the answer should always be that you have gained more new customers, more new users of your service than those that you've lost. So hopefully you'll always have a good answer to the question, what's your churn? It'll always be that growth is outpacing churn. So you're getting more new people than you're losing people during that period. But if you're not, if churn is higher than growth in a particular period, you need to have an answer in terms of why and how you're going to turn that trend around. So that's churn. Low-hanging fruit. So low-hanging fruit is sort of if you've got an issue in a particular part of the business or in the company overall, you'll be brainstorming in terms of what solutions do we have to fix this issue. And generally speaking, there's going to be a handful of what they call low-hanging fruit solutions, right? So this is if you imagine walking up to a tree, right? And so there's a bunch of apples at the bottom, you're really hungry and you've got a whole village to feed, and there's a bunch of apples at the bottom, and then there's a bunch of apples way at the top. You're obviously going to pick the low-hanging fruit first. That's a lot easier. And not only is it easier, but it will help sustain you and the rest of your hungry village while you ultimately turn your efforts to getting up to the top of the tree to get the fruit that's higher up, that's a little bit more difficult to get. So when you say that, well, what's the low-hanging fruit here? Or, oh, those 5 things, those should be relatively easy to implement, those solutions in order to fix this particular issue because those are low-hanging fruit. That's stuff that those are softballs that you ought to be able to hit out of the park. And then you could just hit those and move on to the stuff that's a little bit more complicated. Now, it's a mixed blessing to have low-hanging fruit, right? Because on the one hand, if there's low-hanging fruit to solve a particular issue, then that means you can get some really quick wins, right? You can pick that fruit, you're not hungry anymore, you have a nice burst of energy or whatever it is, and you've solved some issues really quickly. Quick wins, those are always great. On the other hand, if there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, that means you haven't, or your team or somebody on your team hasn't been doing their job very well, because if it's so easy to spot and to pick, then you should have preemptively already picked it so that you didn't run into the problem to begin with. So if there's too much low-hanging fruit, that means you probably haven't been operating your business very well, or you haven't been running this particular product line very well, because there's all this low-hanging fruit that you've neglected to pick and sustain yourself with. So that's low-hanging fruit. Wordsmithing is the next thing I want to go over with you. This is very easy. This just means editing the language that somebody has used in a document or presentation, for example. So it's that somebody's read your document, somebody's read your presentation. Conceptually, they like what you've brought up. So they like your ideas, and that's great. They like how you're thinking about things. They just don't like the language that you've used to make the presentation, the language that you've used to express those concepts and ideas. That might be because you didn't write it very well. You might have to improve your writing skills, or it really just might be because, communication is subjective sometimes and people like things to be said in a particular way versus another way. But the good news here is they like your concepts, they like your ideas, they just want to change the words around a little bit. So if somebody says it needs some wordsmithing, that just means line editing is required, right? Different language is required. Next concept is bandwidth. Somebody will say, well, do you have the bandwidth to take on this additional project? Or somebody will say, look, I just can't take that on right now. I don't have the bandwidth. That just means time. Do you have the time? Do you have space on your plate to add another project? Or I just don't have the time for this. Why people use the word bandwidth, I think it's just one of those, douchey corporate America things that people say just to seem more high level. But it just means, do you have the time, or I don't have the time. That's bandwidth. Drill down, another one of these things people in corporate America say, where they could just say something else. Drill down just means, look, we're looking, here's a concept, we've discussed it on a very surface level, but let's drill down beneath the surface and have a much more detailed, in-depth conversation about that issue. Let's look into details. Let's look into specifics of how we implement, or specifics of what that issue entails. Let's drill down on that topic, or drill down on that issue. And that doesn't necessarily mean right now. Usually when people say, well, let's drill down, they want to set up another meeting or another call to do that, or they want you to come back with additional analysis. They don't necessarily mean right now. So the last concept that I want to go over with you guys today in this part one of this multi-part episode is the concept of, is your business a vertical or a horizontal? And sometimes it can be both, but what's the difference between vertical and horizontal? So a vertical market is one in which all of your customers are in one particular industry, regardless of where they are in the food chain. So for example, if you run an insurance company, you're an insurance provider, right? If you run a manufacturing entity, right, you're in a very specific industry. If you run a hospital, if you run a real estate brokerage, so you're in a very specific vertical. You're in the insurance vertical. Versus if you are in your horizontal market, so let's just say I run an accounting firm, well, all sorts of different sorts of customers in industries across the spectrum need accounting services. So I service lots of different industries. So that's vertical versus horizontal. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really haven't drilled down on any of these concepts in any particular depth. So if you guys have additional questions on any of the jargon that I've talked about today, please feel free to DM me and I'll be happy to get a little bit more detailed in my explanation. I really just wanted to arm you guys with a brief and easy to understand explanation of each of these terms, because they certainly will come up at your meetings and on your calls and in various email chains that you guys are involved in. And I don't want you guys to be caught off guard, to have to ask what it means, or to not follow directions perfectly because you didn't understand the words that were being used. So I do hope you'll join me for part 2 of this episode, because I'm going to go over another whole group of corporate jargon that people typically use in corporate America. And I hope to see you then from the office of the CEO. Please make sure and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss that next part.